Kang Min-Jae's buildings were designed to forget sound. Footsteps softened before they echoed. Voices lowered themselves without being asked. Even the air felt trained to move carefully, as if the walls understood who owned them. Nothing in Min-Jae's world happened by accident. Silence was engineered. Order was enforced. Control was absolute. For 8 years nothing had disturbed it. Not violence. Not betrayal. Not the quiet removal of men who thought they could test him. Kang Min-Jae didn't react to chaos anymore. Reaction required feeling, and feeling had been buried a long time ago. What remained was precision. Clean decisions. Bloodless conclusions. Then, in a private room above the city, glass walls, low light, power disguised as comfort, something went wrong. It wasn't loud. No one fell. No weapon appeared. No order was given. Min-Jae simply stopped moving. Paused too long to be ignored. A stillness that didn't belong. In his hand, a glass untouched. In his chest, a sensation he didn't recognize at first. Warmth. Awareness. A sharp intake of breath he hadn't taken in years. Kiss. Brief. Unannounced. Human. Amara Okoye hadn't asked permission. She hadn't lingered. She hadn't searched his face for a reaction. She stepped in, made a choice, and stepped away again as if nothing in that room could claim her. That was the problem. Power usually announced itself through fear, through hesitation, through people adjusting their behavior the moment Kang Min-Jae entered a space. Amara had done none of that. She didn't flinch, didn't wait, didn't bow. She kissed him like a decision already made. Now, alone in his penthouse office, the city spread beneath him like circuitry. Min-Jae pressed his thumb against his lower lip, as if the feeling might still be there if he tried hard enough. 8 years without touch. Without impulse. Without mistake. And then there was her. The kiss hadn't weakened him. It hadn't softened him. It had done something far more dangerous. It had reminded him that he was still capable of feeling. And Kang Min-Jae had built his entire empire on the belief that he wasn't. The city learned Kang Min-Jae by what it did not do around him. Did not rush. It did not speak out of turn. It did not surprise him. From the upper floors of his headquarters, Seoul spread beneath glass and steel, orderly as circuitry. Streets flowed where they were meant to. Lights obeyed patterns. Even chaos, when it appeared, arrived on schedule and left without complaint. Min-Jae had built it that way. Layer by layer, rule by rule, until nothing reached him unless he allowed it. For 8 years he had allowed nothing. His days moved in clean lines. Meetings began on time and ended before voices rose. Decisions were made without hesitation, delivered without explanation. Loyalty was measured in results, not words. Men mistook his calm for mercy. They were wrong. Mercy implied feeling. Min-Jae operated on something colder. Precision, discipline, distance. Once, long ago, there had been another way to live. He remembered it only as a fact, not a sensation. After the betrayal, after the blood and the silence that followed, something inside him had shut down. Not violently, not all at once, but completely. Like a room where the power cuts and never returns. Whatever had lived there before, impulse, warmth, doubt, was sealed away and buried under rules. Never touch what you can't control. Never want what can be taken from you. Never feel what can be used against you. It had kept him alive. It had kept his empire clean. In his penthouse office, Min-Jae stood at the window, one hand resting lightly against the glass. The reflection looking back at him was composed, exact. A man in command of himself and everything around him. He searched that reflection for questions, for hesitation, for anything that might suggest unrest, and found nothing. That was the problem. Violence no longer raised his pulse. Wealth no longer registered as reward. Power felt inherited rather than earned, a default state he maintained through habit. He had become untouchable, and untouchable meant unchanged. The silence he carried followed him now, heavy and patient, settling into rooms before he did. His lieutenant spoke faster than necessary. His men waited for instructions that did not come. Small things easily missed. Min-Jae noticed them all. Observation was muscle memory. Feeling was not. He turned from the window and crossed the room with measured steps. A file lay open on his desk. Names, numbers, obligations. Scanned and dismissed without interest. His mind moved elsewhere, circling an absence he refused to name. 8 years without mistake. Without longing. Without moments he couldn't account for. He sat, folded his hands once, and let the quiet settle. This was what he had built. A life without edges. A fortress so complete that nothing reached him anymore. No questions. No doubt. No reaction. An emotional grave, perfectly maintained. And until tonight it had been enough. Amara Okoye had learned early that fear was a language people expected her to speak. She rarely did. The venue sat between glass towers and old brick, dressed in discretion rather than excess. Inside, the music stayed low, conversations careful. This was the kind of room where power didn't announce itself. It waited to be recognized. Men arrived with intention written into their posture. Women adjusted themselves without realizing they were doing it. Everyone measured where they stood in relation to someone else. Amara stepped inside and did none of that. Her jacket hung loose over one shoulder, her stride unhurried. She didn't scan for exits. Didn't search faces for approval. She didn't perform confidence or pretend indifference. She simply existed, steady and unclaimed, as if the room belonged to no one and therefore required nothing from her. A few heads turned. Not because she demanded attention but because she failed to react to it. Power moved through the space quietly. When Kang Min-Jae entered, the room adjusted in ways most people never noticed. Conversations softened. Bodies angled away. A subtle clearing formed around him, instinctive and precise. Fear didn't rush, it settled. Men who had been laughing moments earlier lowered their voices. Decisions paused, waiting. Amara felt the shift and ignored it. She accepted a drink she did not taste and set it aside untouched. When someone leaned too close, she stepped away without apology. When another tried to impress her, she smiled once, brief, distant, and turned her attention elsewhere. She wasn't difficult. She was unavailable to expectations. Her gaze met Min-Jae's across the room and held. Not long enough to challenge. Not briefly enough to dismiss. Just long enough to acknowledge that he was there, and that his presence changed nothing about her own. The absence of reaction landed harder than defiance ever could. Min-Jae noticed. Men like him were used to adjustments, hesitation, the careful calculation of what he might want. Amara offered none of it. She moved through the room as if no invisible lines existed, as if power were simply another object to pass by without touching. When she approached him, it was without ceremony. No introduction. No request. No difference. "You look like someone who's been standing still for too long," she said quietly, voice even, almost conversational. The words were not accusation. They weren't praise. They were observation. A few nearby men stiffened. Someone shifted, ready to intervene. Min-Jae did not move. Amara stepped closer. Close enough that he could see the calm in her eyes, the certainty in the way she held herself. No tremor in her hands. No quickened breath. She wasn't daring him. She wasn't testing him. She was choosing a moment. "Don't worry," she added lightly. "I'm not here to ask for anything." That was the moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Amara didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for consequence. She leaned in, made a decision, and then it was over. The kiss was brief, controlled, unmistakably real. She stepped back first, adjusted her jacket. "Have a good night," she said, already turning away. And just like that, she left the space exactly as she had entered it, unbowed, untouched, and entirely her own. The room corrected itself first. Music resumed at its careful volume. Conversations found their rhythm again. Men relaxed shoulders they hadn't realized were tense. Someone laughed a fraction too loudly, as if to prove nothing unusual had happened. Kang Min-Jae did not move. He stood exactly where he was, glass still untouched in his hand, aware of a sensation that did not belong. It wasn't heat or desire. It wasn't even shock. It was awareness, sharp and immediate, like the sudden return of sound after years of silence. His breath caught halfway in, unfamiliar in its urgency. His heart skipped once, then again, as if remembering its job. Kiss. Brief. Human. It should have been dismissed. Labeled impulse. Corrected. Min-Jae had ended lives for less disruption than this. But the instinct to respond, anger, command, consequence, never arrived. What followed instead was something far more dangerous. Presence. He felt the room again. The weight of his body, the pressure of his shoes against the floor, the low hum of the city outside the glass walls. 8 years of controlled numbness fractured in a single quiet moment, and through the cracks slipped something alive. Amara Okoye was already gone. That too unsettled him. She hadn't waited for reaction, hadn't searched his face for meaning. She had stepped in, made her choice, and stepped away as if the moment belonged only to her. As if power did not require permission. Min-Jae's men watched him carefully, reading for signals they had learned to obey. None came. He remained still, jaw tightening slightly. Not in anger, not in desire, but recognition. Something had shifted. Later, alone in his penthouse office, the city glowing beneath him, Min-Jae pressed his thumb lightly against his lower lip. The gesture surprised him. Felt almost instinctive. As if his body were checking for proof that the moment had been real. It was 8 years without touch. Without impulse. Without mistake. And now this, small, precise, impossible to ignore. The kiss replayed itself without invitation. The steadiness in her eyes. The absence of fear. The way she hadn't taken anything from him. Not even attention. That was the wound. Power had always demanded reaction. Submission, resistance, negotiation. Amara had offered none. She had not tried to impress him. She had not tried to survive him. She had simply chosen, and in doing so, left him with something he hadn't carried in years. Question. What had he given up to stay in control? Min-Jae moved away from the window and poured a drink he did not touch. The city below remained obedient, vast and silent, but it no longer grounded him. The sensation in his chest lingered. Not urgent, not loud, persistent. The kiss had not weakened him. It had not softened him. It had reminded him that numbness was not the same as strength. And that realization, quiet as it was, felt like the most dangerous thing he had faced in 8 years. Morning returned with discipline. Briefings were delivered on time. Decisions were made without hesitation. A meeting ended before it could stretch into inefficiency. Kang Min-Jae allowed the rhythm to resume, allowed the illusion of continuity to stand. From the outside nothing had changed. From the inside everything registered. He noticed the elevator's hum beneath his feet and felt it as motion instead of noise. He caught the faint scent of coffee as it passed the doorway and recognized it before dismissing it. In conversation, he listened a second longer than necessary, not for information but for cadence, for what lingered beneath words. Awareness arrived in pieces, inconvenient and precise, like a map unfolding where there had once been blank space. It irritated him. Awareness was a door. Doors led to rooms he had sealed. At his desk a report lay open. He scanned the first page, then closed it without reading. His gaze drifted to the window, to the clean geometry of the city, and stalled. He pressed his fingers together once, then released them. The motion suggested agitation. He stilled it immediately. Control corrected habits. Control always had. But the pauses kept appearing. Small, unaccountable gaps where his mind circled something it refused to name. He asked a question twice in a briefing, waved it away, and felt the faintest ripple of surprise from the room. His lieutenant spoke more carefully than usual. The men waited. measuring silence they had once trusted. Min-Jae felt it too. The silence had weight now. It followed him. Violence no longer registered as neutral. Felt loud. Wealth felt hollow. Power, once a steady constant, shifted under his hands, not slipping away but asking to be held differently. He had lived for 8 years inside certainty. Now certainty required maintenance. He stood and paced once, caught himself and stopped. Movement suggested unrest. He breathed instead, slow and deliberate, counting seconds the way he used to count exits. The technique worked, mostly. It returned his posture, not his ease. Amara Okoye surfaced without invitation. Not her face exactly. Her steadiness. The way she had stood close without leaning in. Had left without waiting. The absence of leverage. The refusal to belong to the moment she created. He had expected anger. Consequence. Silence that demanded response. What he received was quiet that asked nothing. Recognition, not desire, tightened in his chest. He had built a life anticipating outcomes, removing variables before they mattered. And yet something had entered and exited without asking to stay. Worse, without wanting to be remembered. Min-Jae rested his palm against the glass. The city reflected him back, composed and intact. He searched the image for weakness and found none. What unsettled him was not weakness, but exposure. The realization that numbness had never been strength, had been a truce. And truce implied an enemy. His phone buzzed. He ignored it. Then, after a beat too long, he answered. "Find out who was at the venue," he said when the report ended. Quietly. Was. Not her. No. The line went dead. Min-Jae remained at the window, aware of a fracture he would not rush to repair. He would not chase the feeling. He would not bury it either. For now he would observe. And observation, he told himself, was still control. Amara noticed the shift before anyone spoke it out loud. It arrived dressed as convenience. A doorman who knew her name without being told. A bartender who waved off her tab with a polite smile that lingered a second too long. An envelope slipped beneath her apartment door instead of a message sent to her phone. Heavy paper, unmarked, the time and place precise. Power announcing itself without asking. She studied the envelope once, then left it on the counter and went to work. Amara had spent too much of her life learning how easily attention turned into expectation. How quickly interest became a claim if you didn't interrupt it early. She had no intention of becoming a story people told about a man like Kang Min-Jae. That night she chose a different bar. Smaller. Louder. No velvet ropes, no watchful eyes pretending not to watch. She laughed with the bartender, danced to a song she loved, let herself exist without meaning anything to anyone else. When 2 men stepped into the room, she noticed immediately. They didn't scan the crowd like predators. They didn't posture. They waited, calm, still, as if the space would rearrange itself for them. One met her gaze briefly, then looked away. That was the tell. Amara finished her drink and stood without urgency. She moved toward the door. One of the men shifted just enough to block her path. "Miss Okoye," he said politely. "Our employer would like a word." She looked at him, then at his partner, then past them to the open street beyond. Her pulse stayed even. "You can tell your employer," she said, voice steady, "that if he wants to speak to me, he knows where I was last time. Was. He prefers not to repeat himself." Amara smiled, slow, sharp, without warmth. Then he should get used to disappointment. She stepped around them before they could decide how to respond and pushed the door open. Cold air met her face, clean and honest. She welcomed it. Behind her, the men didn't follow. The pressure returned in other forms. An invitation to a gallery opening she hadn't asked to attend. A brand hinting at collaboration without explaining why. A rooftop party where curiosity had shifted into measurement. At one event, a woman leaned close, voice light, eyes sharp. "You're becoming a topic," she said. Amara sipped her drink. "That sounds exhausting." Men like Kang Min-Jae don't enjoy unanswered questions. Then maybe they shouldn't build systems that can't handle them. The smile she received was thin. Later someone laughed and asked, half joking, "So, who's backing you these days?" Amara removed the hand that had lingered too long on her arm. "I back myself." The laughter that followed didn't settle. That night, she stood on her fire escape, city lights blinking like distant signals. She felt the attention now, sharper, more deliberate, but not threatening. "Measuring figures," she murmured. She had not challenged power. She had not bowed to it either. And somewhere in the quiet between those two choices, something important had been decided. Not by them. By her. The question surfaced the way poison always did. Quietly, politely, dressed as concern. It came up in a private room above a restaurant Kang Min-Jae had owned long enough that no one remembered who sold it to him. The walls were soundproofed. The wine was expensive. The men around the table spoke carefully, as if careful speech might protect them from consequences. "She's becoming undefined," one of them said, swirling his glass. "Undefined elements create instability." Another nodded. "People are asking questions." Min-Jae listened without interruption. He already knew which question they meant. It had been moving through the city for days now, sharpening as it went, turning curiosity into expectation. Who does she belong to? The question had nothing to do with Amara Okoye. Not really. It was about order, about reassurance, about men who felt safer when every woman in a room could be placed, claimed or dismissed. "She's visible," someone added. Visibility invites speculation. Min-Jae cut his steak once. Precise. Clean. Speculation isn't the problem. Attachment is, another replied. The table went quiet. Min-Jae lifted his gaze slowly. Not angry. Not cold. Simply present. "Careful," he said. Across the city, Amara felt the pressure arrive like weather. Subtle, unavoidable. A hand lingered too long at a gallery opening. A smile carried an edge it hadn't before. Someone asked, half laughing, half serious, whether she'd considered hiring security. She declined without spectacle. She always did. Back in the private room, the conversation shifted the way it always did when patience wore thin. Stability. Precedent. Words used when force wasn't yet permitted. "She doesn't fit," one man said gently. "That makes her a problem." Min-Jae set his glass down untouched. "She isn't part of the equation." Silence followed. Not shock, calculation. "That's not how things work," someone said, as if explaining gravity. Min-Jae met his eyes. "That's exactly how they work. You've just grown used to pretending otherwise." The meeting ended without resolution. That unsettled them more than refusal. Later, alone in his office, Min-Jae watched the city breathe. Conversations stopped a second too late in rooms he hadn't entered. Invitations arrived with unnecessary urgency. His name surfaced where it hadn't before. The underworld was adjusting, recalibrating around a variable it didn't understand. Amara Okoye. His phone rang. He answered without greeting. "They're pushing," his lieutenant said. "Someone wants to make a point." Min-Jae's jaw tightened, not in anger but resolve. "No one touches her." And if they don't listen? Min-Jae's voice remained quiet. "Certain. Then they'll learn where the line actually is." Across the city, Amara stood on her fire escape, the night cool against her skin. She felt eyes on her from places she couldn't see. Not threatening. Measuring. "Figures," she murmured again. Two forces were moving now. One trying to cage her. One refusing to let the cage exist. And for the first time, Kang Min-Jae understood what the city was really asking of him. Not who she belonged to, but whether he was willing to dismantle a world that demanded an answer. Kang Min-Jae did not announce the change. Power that needed declaration was already eroding. What shifted instead were the habits. Small, deliberate refusals in rooms where decisions had always moved the same way. Invitations went unanswered. Requests returned without comment. Long-standing expectations met silence where compliance had once lived. Men noticed. They noticed because he stopped correcting assumptions. He no longer reassured allies who wanted clarity about where Amara Okoye fit into the hierarchy. He allowed conversations to end without answers, let discomfort stretch until it became instructive. "She's not part of the equation," he told one man flatly. "Stop trying to turn her into one." The room had gone still. For 8 years, Min-Jae had ruled by anticipation, by removing variables before they could become inconvenient. Amara had done something no rival ever had. She had remained a variable by refusing to be managed. The cost arrived quietly. A shipment delayed without explanation. A meeting postponed twice before being cancelled altogether. A familiar ally hesitating just long enough to be noticed. None of it rose to the level of threat. All of it was pressure. "They won't like this," his lieutenant said carefully. Min-Jae looked up from the file he was closing. "They don't have to." That was the choice. Not ownership. Not elimination. Not distance masquerading as safety. Restraint. Protection without proximity. Authority without claim. The underworld was built on predictability. You took what mattered or you removed it. Min-Jae did neither, and in doing so, destabilized something older than violence. That night, he walked the city alone. No driver. No escort. Just the quiet weight of streets that knew him. Even without witnesses. He passed places he owned and places he didn't, felt the pulse of a world that continued whether he shaped it or not. For the first time in years, he let himself register that movement instead of standing above it. Across town, Amara felt the pressure ease. Not vanish but change. Less invasive. Less sharp. Like a hand withdrawing before it could close into a fist. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She stared at it for a moment, then answered. "You changed something," she said, not bothering with greeting. "Yes," Min-Jae replied. "And it cost you." "Yes." She smiled softly, unseen. "Good." Silence followed. Not charged. Not heavy. Honest. "I won't ask you to trust me," he said. "I won't ask you for anything at all." "I know," Amara replied. "That's why this works." Works wasn't the word Min-Jae would have chosen, but he understood what she meant. Balance. Distance held by choice, not fear. When the call ended, he stood at the edge of the street and looked up at the city lights, not as territory but as possibility. He had not lost control. He had refined it. And in choosing restraint over dominance, Kang Min-Jae realized he had stepped out of the emotional grave he had maintained for 8 years. He was still dangerous, just no longer empty. The shift did not announce itself with violence. It arrived in absences. Rooms where Kang Min-Jae was expected did not fill. Conversations that waited for his approval ended without it. Requests that once carried urgency returned unanswered. Their assumptions quietly rejected. He did not explain himself. Explanation invited negotiation. He offered none. What unsettled people wasn't what he did. It was what he stopped doing. He no longer corrected men who spoke as if Amara Okoye were a problem to be solved. He didn't reassure partners who wanted clarity, who needed to know where she fit, who she answered to, what leverage existed. He let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable enough to expose the question beneath it. "She doesn't belong to anyone." In a private room above a restaurant, someone finally said it aloud. "This creates uncertainty." Min-Jae met the man's gaze, calm and unyielding. "Uncertainty isn't the threat you think it is." The city adjusted slowly, reluctantly. Power always resisted redefinition. It preferred familiar shapes. Ownership, hierarchy, containment. Min-Jae dismantled those expectations without spectacle. He refused alignment when it required explanation. He declined reassurance when it demanded sacrifice. He let people sit with the discomfort of a world that no longer behaved the way they had memorized. At night, he stood at his office window and watched the city breathe. Not as circuitry this time, not as territory. As movement. As life continuing with or without his permission. He felt the weight of that awareness and did not push it away. Across the city, Amara noticed the difference in the way attention approached her. Less probing. Less entitlement. The questions shifted from implication to curiosity, from claim to observation. People still watched. They always would. But the edge had dulled. The pressure no longer carried the promise of consequence. She didn't thank him for it. She didn't need to. They met again without ceremony. A small cafe that stayed open past reason. Low light. Soft music that asked nothing. Min-Jae paused at the door out of habit, catalogued exits, then let the reflex go. Amara sat with a chipped mug between her hands, posture easy, eyes present. Neither of them rushed. "You could have made this easier," he said quietly once he was close enough to speak. Amara leaned back slightly. Easy usually costs more in the end. He considered that. "You're not wrong." Silence settled, not tense, not charged. "Honest. You don't want anything from me," she said at last. "Not a question." "No," Min-Jae replied. "I want to understand why." She studied him, then shook her head gently. "That's not something you take." He nodded. He already knew. When she stood, he did not stop her. Did not ask her to stay. He watched her move past him, felt the faint warmth of her presence, and let it go. That mattered. Alone again, Min-Jae understood what he had changed. Power, he realized, did not require possession. It could exist as protection without proximity, authority without ownership, restraint without weakness. For 8 years he had believed control meant containment. Now he knew better. He had redefined it. And the city, uneasy and watchful, began to learn the difference. Sleep came slowly, but it came. That alone marked the change. Kang Min-Jae lay awake longer than he used to, not because his mind raced, but because it wandered. The city beyond the glass pulsed softly, no longer something he monitored, but something he shared space with. When sleep finally claimed him, it did so without force, without vigilance. He did not dream of blood or strategy. He dreamed of movement, of streets, of light shifting across faces, of moments that did not ask to be controlled. Morning arrived without resistance. He dressed with the same precision, moved through the day with the same authority, but the difference lived beneath the surface. He felt the weight of his coat, the texture of paper beneath his fingers, the subtle shift in a room when he entered, not as validation but as information. Awareness had become companion instead of threat. At his desk, he opened a report and read it all the way through. Choice, he realized, was the difference. Before, everything had been reflex, survival disguised as discipline. Now, he noticed the space between impulse and action and understood that space as freedom. He could feel without being ruled by it. He could allow presence without surrendering control. Later, he stood at the window one last time. City lights scattered below like possibilities instead of obligations. He pressed his palm to the glass, not searching for reflection this time, but grounding himself in the reality of where he stood. 8 years ago, he had buried feeling because it had nearly destroyed him. He had called the grave strength. He had mistaken numbness for safety. He knew better now. His phone buzzed. Message this time. No name. No request. Still choosing. He smiled faintly. Always. Across the city, Amara sat on her fire escape, knees drawn close, listening to music low enough to think through. She felt the city the same way she always had. Alive, imperfect, unconcerned with ownership. Her phone chimed. She read the reply and nodded once, satisfied. Whatever this was, it remained unclaimed. And that was why it worked. Kang Min-Jae turned from the window and walked back into his life, not as a man preserved in silence, but as one who moved through the world awake. He had not lost power. He had not surrendered authority. He had gained something rarer. The ability to choose what he felt. And the kind of strength that came from no longer being afraid of it.